Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first of the TRANSCEND Seminar Series. Today's talk is by Dr. Gary Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz received a PhD in biological psychology from the Downstate Medical Center in New York City. He did a postdoctoral fellowship in epidemiology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he completed an MPH and a second PhD in epidemiology. He is presently Professor of Population Health at UND and serves as the principal investigator of the TRANSCEND study, a 5-year NIH grant whose goal is to increase the workforce of clinical and translational researchers in North Dakota. The title of his talk today is Natural Radioactivity in North Dakota, What Me Worry? Please welcome Dr. Schwartz.
How's everyone's Thanksgiving? Good? Good. All right, can you hear me? Okay, super. Super. Okay, we're good. We're good. All right, I think we're ready to rock and roll. By the way, that was my Ozempic face. I'm feeling much better now. So, let me tell you what I want to do in the next 45 minutes or so. I want to basically remind you of some things you may know about radon, and maybe tell you some things you don't know. Tell you what some of the problems are about radon in North Dakota and what I think some of the solutions to it might be. And the take-home message that I really would like you to focus on is the idea that radon is really our problem for reasons that you'll appreciate, I hope. And UND has the opportunity to be a national leader in radon research. Okay, so before we can talk meaningfully about radon, we need to get right about what radon is. This is a very complicated slide, but I hope you'll walk through it with me. It tells you basically everything you need to know about radon. For starters, radon does come from underground. Whether it has an N in it or not, it still comes from underground. It comes from underground because radon is a gas that is produced by the natural decay of uranium and other radioactive elements in rocks and soil. So uranium has a half-life in the billions of years, B for billions. So radon is naturally off-gassed by uranium. It's under pressure and will enter your home through crevices in the basement or through other cracks in the foundation. Radon itself is technically inert. It's a noble gas. However, radon undergoes a series of changes as it evolves to lead, in which case it liberates enormous amounts of energy. This energy is in the form of mostly alpha radiation. So if you want to think about radon, you can think of the sparklers that maybe you had when you were a kid or that maybe you've bought for your own kids. Do you know the sparks that come off? Well, that's essentially what's happening with radon gas. Radon is releasing alpha energy, which is high linear acceleration energy that is powerful enough to knock electrons out of their orbits. And that's why it's ionizing radiation. The problem comes in when radon gets into your home and you breathe it in. So if you inhale radon, the radon will likely localize in your trachea or bronchioles, and there it will release alpha particles as it decays towards lead. That's not a good thing because the cells that it doesn't kill will not make you stronger. It will actually interact with DNA and cause cancer. And what is little appreciated is the fact that radon is the second largest cause of lung cancer after smoking. It causes about 21,000 deaths per year. That is more than the number of people who die every year from drunk driving. And it is approximately the same as the number of people who die from homicides involving handguns. But you don't really hear a lot about radon. You don't hear a lot about radon because As you know from the last slide, it's invisible, it's tasteless, it's odorless. It's very hard to motivate people against invisible threats. Well, it's a threat that you really want to think about in North Dakota, because here's a map of EPA radon zones. And due to an interesting historical accident, the government realized at one point that some homes have more radon in them than uranium mines. And many of these homes are in the upper tier of the US. And this is because when glaciers moved in during the Pleistocene, they dug up deep earth elements like uranium. And these elements, which were low in the Earth's crust, are now on top. So to put this in perspective, the combination of high uranium and cold winters, because the colder it is, the more likely it is that the uranium gas is under positive pressure. Think for a minute, and I know this never happens, but think if it ever got to be, say, 30 below in North Dakota. I know it's a stretch, it'll never happen. But if it does, and you heat your home to 70 degrees, you've now created a 100-degree temperature difference between the ground and your home. What happens to hot air? It rises. So you're creating a suction whereby the radon enters your home, but because heating your home is very expensive, you've sealed it up. So the radon gas gets in, and it doesn't get out. And being at home is an issue because even before the pandemic, the average amount of time that Americans spent in their home was 16 and a half hours a day. So if you're sitting in your home, particularly if you're in your basement, where the radon levels are highest, you could be exposed to a considerable amount of radioactivity. Now, unless you're a radiation physicist, these numbers don't really mean very much to you. The EPA, for example, has a criterion, a cut point of about 4 picocuries. The average radon, this is the level by which the EPA recommends you remediate your home for radon gas. The average radon level in homes in the US is about 1.3 picocuries. The average in Grand Forks is 11.7. So it is 9 times the average radon level in the US. For all intents and purposes, Grand Forks is the most radioactive city in the United States. Now again, 4 picocuries, it doesn't mean much to you, likely, but if you want to think of it in terms of what does this mean, say, in terms of carcinogens that most people understand, say cigarettes, all you need to do is multiply the radon levels in picocuries by 2. So a radon level of 4 picocuries is the equivalent of 8 cigarettes. A radon level of 20, which by the way is found in about 15% of homes in Grand Forks, is equivalent to 40 cigarettes or 2 packs a day. There are homes 100 picocuries and above. Again, this is on top of any other exposure that you might have. And again, it's invisible, tasteless, colorless, and odorless. You would have no idea that you're being exposed to it unless you test it. Now, to get a better understanding of how the EPA came up with a number of 4, there's a really fascinating history behind this. Anybody who remembers who Paracelsus was? The father of toxicology. Paracelsus was the father of toxicology, famous for defining poisons as there is no poison. Everything is a poison, only the dose matters. Take it to northern Germany, the Ore Mountains, Schneeberg, which means snow mountain. Miners were dying of an unusual form of consumption, which was first described by Paracelsus. It was later described by Gregorius Agricola, who wrote the first textbook of mining, who reported that he'd met women who had been married 8 times because the first 7 of their husbands all died from Schneeberger disease. It was about 300 years later that Schneeberger disease was recognized as lung cancer. Now you might think, how could it possibly have taken so long? A first-year graduate student can take a look at this picture, by the way, which was drawn in 1730, so this really did go on for hundreds of years, and say, well, either this man was starved to death, or he has severe cachexia, which is likely the result of cancer. Well, it was identified as lung cancer in 1879 because at that time, lung cancer was an extremely rare disease. In fact, there were only about 35 cases of lung cancer reported in the world literature. We take lung cancer for granted now because we've created that epidemic through cigarettes. Lung cancer became common only after the development of the cigarette rolling machine in the 1900s, when it became possible to cheaply roll your own cigarettes. Some 20 years later, radium and radon were discovered by Marie Curie and her husband. And in 1932, Czech scientists on the other side of the mountain, Schneeberg is in the Ore Mountains in what was then Saxony, but the other side of the mountain was a Czechoslovakian city called Joachimsthal, or Joachim's Valley. And pathologists in Joachimsthal went into the mines in Schneeberg and Joachimsthal, correlated the depths of the mines with the number of miners with lung cancer, and came to the astonishing conclusion that lung cancer was actually caused by this invisible gas. And this paper is available online, and it is an amazing mind blower. It is so clearly written, and it is so fascinating, and was, of course, largely ignored, like a lot of original things, but is really, really worth your time. I should mention this town, Joachimsthal, was, of course, a silver mine, and they made a very large silver coin there, the Joachimsthaler, or thaler, which is the origin of the American word dollar. So after a while, you will realize that all roads lead to radon. Anyhow, the paper claiming that lung cancer was actually caused by this invisible gas was largely ignored in this country until about the 1950s, when the US suddenly needed uranium in the worst possible way to compete with the Soviet Union. And by the way, the Soviet Union was mining uranium in Joachimsthal. And what happened is that the miners, many of whom were Native American in the area in the Four Corners region of the US, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, developed lung cancer at a very high rate. And it became clear that, yeah, actually radon does cause lung cancer. And sadly, in the 1960s, after mining all this uranium, slag uranium piles mounted up. And if you've gone to Utah, you will still see them on the side of the road, was used as landfill in a new development. And what do you think might happen if you took all this uranium and tucked it underneath homes? Well, the homes basically glowed in the dark. They were so radioactive that the US Army Corps of Engineers was brought in, and they said, well, could you fix this? And the answer is, well, no, not really, but we could lower it. And we could lower it to about 4 picocuries. And that's the origin of the EPA standard. So a lot of people think, oh, my home is below 4 picocuries, I'm safe. No, there was no level of radiation that's safe. 4 levels of picocuries was simply attainable. And that's how the standard came about. I have a complete disclosure to make. A lot of people think, hey, Gary, he's that like radon guy. Well, maybe. But I'm a cancer epidemiologist, but I never thought about radon until I got here. I never really thought about it. What I was really interested in was this figure from this graph. This is chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which you may know is the commonest cancer in the Western world. It's largely a tumor of elderly people, people in their 60s and 70s, who come in for other medical conditions. They need a pap smear, they need a PSA test, they need their blood pressure medicine changed. A sample of blood is drawn, and they have more than 5 million B cells per milliliter. Bingo. They have chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Now, what's interesting here is that this bar here, this is the incidence rate, the age-adjusted rate. So the effects of age are taken out of this slide. The highest rate in the US is found in North Dakota, and very low rates in places like Arizona and the District of Columbia, places where there are a lot of hematologists. Now, there's no way that this very high rate of CLL is due to people overusing medical facilities. We don't have a lot of healthcare providers in North Dakota, and we certainly don't have an overabundance of hematologists. So this was like, what is that about? And of course, the cause of CLL is unknown, which is what attracted me. And then because I didn't know much about radon, my feeling was, well, what causes other leukemias? There's 3 other kinds of leukemia. Well, it turns out all the other forms of leukemia are caused by exposure to ionizing radiation. And then I naively said, well, is there any ionizing radiation in North Dakota? Oh, no kidding. In any event, to get some sense of whether there was any traction to that idea, this is the mean radon level per state, and here you are in North Dakota. And this is the incidence rate of chronic lymphocytic leukemia by state. And okay, there's in general a positive relationship between it, but it's not just at the level of the state. If you break down the data at the level of the county, and here you are in Grand Forks, there's a positive relationship between any of the data we could get our hands on in terms of the more radiation in homes, the higher the incidence of chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Now, how could that possibly work? Well, you may know that the precursor to chronic lymphocytic leukemia, just the way the precursor to another blood cancer, malignant melanoma, is a benign proliferation of B cells. So you get too many B cells, and then one of them goes bad, and then the rest of them proliferate. That's called B-cell lymphocytosis, fancy word for too many B cells, sometimes known as clonal, because it originates from one cell, clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential, or CHIP. But what you see is that if you take B cells and expose them to radon, radon itself causes a proliferation of B cells. So radon is capable, at least in theory, of causing B-cell lymphocytosis, the known precursor of chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about events that promote proliferation, you probably know that cancer really is a multi-step process. It's really a 2-step process. The first step is lesions in DNA occur. Then the second is that those lesions are proliferated. So things that cause cancer are either initiators or promoters. Sometimes they're both. In this case, radon is both. It's the whole enchilada. It's an initiator and a promoter. And just to point out, this is not just speculation based on getting some data from one source and graphing it against another. You may know that the Women's Health Initiative, which is the largest prospective study of women's health in the history of the world, actually, which was begun by Lou Culler at the University of Pittsburgh some years ago. We had data from the Women's Health Initiative about health events, including stroke. And by the way, CHIP, or clonal hematopoiesis, is a known risk factor for stroke, in addition to being a risk factor for leukemia. And we're able to use those radon zones and adjudicated health events. So every woman who had a stroke or had a diagnosis of clonal hematopoiesis, their medical records were adjudicated by 3 physicians. So this is the highest level of data you can pretty much get to. And there is a relationship between radon exposure, clonal hematopoiesis, or B-cell lymphocytosis, and stroke in the Women's Health Initiative. And these are my colleagues at Chapel Hill and Wake Forest. And if you squint really hard, you can find my name in there somewhere. But the important point here is that not only does radon cause lung cancer, duh, we know that, but radon also causes stroke and may cause asthma in children, which is a separate issue. So the reason what you might worry about is that, anyone know what the 3 major causes of death are in the United States? Cancer, cardiovascular disease, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Radon has got a triple play on all those disorders. And by the way, one of the nice things about being at a place like UND is that this work was done by my colleagues. This is work done by Marilyn Klug in population health, and this is work done by Christina Wancha in population health. So there's a lot of opportunities for work on radon, and what I'm going to be able to talk to you about now is work largely done with my colleague Soo-Jung Kim in the Department of Communication. Okay, let's get back to one of the problems about radon. Radon is not a joke. It's a contributor to the 3 largest causes of death in the United States. People do not test for it. It is very, very hard to convince people to test for an invisible hazard with a long latency. I often say it's like trying to teach your 9-year-old to start planning for retirement. There are concepts that they don't get. Save now, well, what exactly is retirement? Yeah. It's not on the top list of things to do. I got to get my dry cleaning, I got to pick up the kids from school, I got to test the house for radon. The radon can wait. So it's been very, very hard to test. And to put numbers on this, even though the Surgeon General says test every home for radon because 1 in 15 US homes has high radon levels, and 2 out of 3 homes in North Dakota do, so we're definitely winning the prize there, only about 15% of homes have ever been tested. So a question we have to ask ourselves, well, maybe it's our fault. Maybe the way we communicate about radon is just ineffective. Well, clearly it's ineffective, whether that's at fault or not. So we're trying to think of ways to do better. You think about methods of communication. The printing press was an amazing revolution. There's probably nothing like it in history. But as a means of communication, it was great in disseminating the Bible in German. I'm not sure it's really the best way to communicate now. So think for a second. If you had an important message you wanted to send, like test, fix, save a life, which is the method for radon communication in Utah, would you print that up on brochures like these and hand them out in front of Hugo's? Or would you maybe text them to 200 of your closest friends? Well, so working with Dr. Kim in communications, we decided, well, what if we took existing radon information as brochures, which does not seem to be very effective, and turned it into an app for your phone? I don't know if you've noticed this. People tend to like their phones. It's just between you and me. I want to give you the insight that I have. And what if we turned it into a phone app? Yes, we have an app for that. Would people learn about radon with the app? Well, sure. Sure they would. But that doesn't answer the question. The question we really want to ask is the app better than brochures? And really, the only way you can answer a question, is one thing better than other, is via a head-to-head comparison of the two of them. Now, I have to say, a lot of people are under the misperception that clinical trials are something that's done, that's very fancy, that's very complicated, that is used to test the superiority of one drug versus another. Yes, they are, but clinical trials are simply a method by which people are allocated into different groups, and the investigator, in this case you or me, determines their exposure. That's what a clinical trial is. A clinical trial is where the investigator determines the exposure. So it's basically a trial, an experiment with humans. So we wanted to conduct an experiment with humans in which some people received information from the app and some people received information from a brochure. So the simplest way in which we can do that is to conduct a clinical trial. And if you've never seen a clinical trial done before, I'm going to show you how complicated these really are. Pay close attention, because this is really complicated. The people who are eligible for a clinical trial could be seen as this deck of cards. Okay? So what I am doing right now is shuffling the deck of cards. And if we have individuals, and these cards are individuals, if they previously tested their homes for radon, well, they know something about radon, so there's no point in including them, right? So they're excluded. Then we have 138 people left. Watch closely, because I am randomizing. I know. Don't try this at home. This is a job for an epidemiologist. After people are randomized, they're put into two categories. She loves me not. She loves me not. And then they take a pretest, what they know about radon. Are they worried about radon? We measure things like self-efficacy, knowledge, and other things. They are either assigned to the radon app, which is the She Loves Me group, or the brochures, She Loves Me Not. Same information. It just differs in the way the information is delivered. And then we test them again. What did you learn? What do you think? What might you do? Okay? So that's how clinical trials work. And then we analyze the data, of course. So what I'm going to show you is a couple of slides that all have the same format. This is the score on the items we're interested in: knowledge, what your attitudes are, whether you think you can make a change, whether this gives you a feeling of control in your life. So this is pre-exposure to the app or the brochure, and this is post. And one of the first things that you see is that, well, these were actually undergraduates at UND, and that is, well, you can learn about radon either way, where the app is shown in red and the brochure is in blue, but you learn better, actually. You learn more on the app. And by the way, these were multiple choice questions in the knowledge, like radon is a gas, radon causes cancer, radon is invisible. And on it was 14 multiple choice questions. What you can see is that people do nothing about radon because their average score is 7, which is chance on true or false questions. Now, one of the things we also measured not only was what they knew, but they were given the opportunity to order a free radon test. And the radon tests were barcoded, so we knew whether they ordered them or used them or not. And one of the things that's very striking is that if you had the chance to order a free radon test on the app, 41% of people did. If you could order a free radon test on the brochures by returning a prepaid postcard, only 13% did. So the app is way better in terms of getting people interested in testing. That's the good news. The bad news is that nobody really used them. They got the tests, but they didn't return them to the lab. Now, at first I thought, well, this is because these are college students. They have every right to believe that UND is not going to put them in a dorm that's radioactive, which is sort of true. I've worked with facilities to measure radon in some of the housing, and the housing that was radioactive has been scrapped. So now they have every right to believe that. So the good news is that they learn more on the app, and they ordered tests more frequently. But, and this is the secret that I revealed to you earlier, young people are really cool about using their phones. Older people, not so much. So maybe we sort of kind of biased it in our favor by testing this in college students. So we did it again by testing parents who were older and were dropping their kids off at a daycare. And the question is the app really better among the parents? And again, we hired a part-time epidemiologist to do the complicated randomization and took 116 people. Some of them had previously tested. They were randomized into two groups, 52 to the app, 52 to the brochure. Some of them were lost to follow-up. By the way, a lot more were lost to follow-up, actually, in the brochure condition. That's because brochures are boring compared to phones, which is further evidence why you'd want to use a phone. Long story short, this looks just like what you just looked at. Do people learn from the app or from the brochure? Of course they do. But you know what? They learn a lot better in the app. And again, these are multiple choice true-false questions. These are adults, largely college-educated people in Grand Forks, North Dakota, in the most radioactive city, in the most radioactive state, yet they don't know the difference between radon and Ray-Bans. They're operating at chance. They're operating at chance. The good thing is, not only did we replicate the finding that individuals learn better and drop out less, but they also requested the app 3 times more. So the app is much better at getting people to order the test. That's the good news. The bad news is the magic stopped there. People got really interested in radon. They ordered a test, but these tests were barcoded, so we know who was naughty and who was nice. Okay? We know who returns it, and we know who didn't. So we weren't asking, well, did you return your test? People say, oh, well, of course I did. You did not. Okay. So what did we learn so far? Well, is the app superior to brochures? Absolutely. It's better in radon knowledge. It's better in self-efficacy. It's way better in getting people to request the tests. But it's not really good at getting them to use them. And that's kind of the issue. But you know what? I think that's solvable. But what we learned so far is that there's no one key to unlock the problem of radon testing. And this is why radon testing, while it sounds like an easy thing to do, it's really not. It's a series of steps, and a failure in any one of the steps is going to result in a failure to actually test. So it's a combination lock. You have to get people to know about radon, otherwise why test? You have to make the tests available, and the app does a great job of making the tests available, but you have to build in some follow-through. So, any ideas about simple ways to get follow-through? This is your phone, right? Ever get a message that says, hey, you got an appointment at 12. Looking forward to seeing you there. Okay? This is exactly what other groups do in cancer screening tests. So, for example, there's a very similar problem faced by at-home screening tests, like colorectal screening tests, where people get the test in the mail, but don't return them. I have a really nice plant growing out of a little bucket that I got from my first screening test. I got the test, but didn't return. I kept thinking, well, this is a great bucket. It'll be great for a plant. But I would get little calls. Hey, Gary, looks like you got your Cologuard test. How come you haven't returned it? So one of the things we're working on now is to build in and test the idea that if you got a test and didn't return it, maybe a couple of reminders, maybe a postcard will result in getting you to return it. Because once you have the app, adding a reminder function to it costs nothing. So what do we know about smartphones? They definitely communicate radon risk. They do a very good job of it. We've done now 3 randomized trials, and they beat the pants off brochures. Now, if you think, by the way, about remote areas where it's even hard to deliver paper goods, the app might be the way to go. So Sujung Kim and I have been approached by states as remote and different as Nevada and Alaska, asking whether they can use the app in order to teach people about radon from a distance. Radon testing definitely involves multiple steps, and a failure in any one of them is going to result in a failure at the end. What I want to talk about briefly now is the possibility not of just generalized radon knowledge and testing, but about the real importance of actually putting your money where your mouth is. There is an enormous synergy between smoking and radon. It's one of the largest synergies really in the literature, whereby if you are a smoker exposed to 20 picocuries, which is not that much, again, that's 10-15% of homes right here in Grand Forks are at 20 picocuries, and smoke, 1 in 4 of those people will develop lung cancer. And of course, if you're a smoker, there are other people in your house, often, like kids, who are respiring at a faster rate than adults, who are 10 to 20 times more likely to develop cancer because they have a longer way to go. So if you develop lung cancer when you're 80, and it takes 10 or 15 years for it to kill you, well, maybe you'll outlive, as it were, the cancer. But if you initiate lung cells when you're 10, you've got a long runway now. So it's quite possible that lung cancer that occurs in people who are in their 40s and 50s, and there are lung cancers that occur in people in their 30s, is due to early life experiences. So maybe a place to go, really a place to go, is to target smokers. Well, we're already targeting smokers because you may be aware that every state in the US and every territory, as well as every province in Canada and every Canadian territory, have these tobacco quit lines where you can call if you want to quit smoking. And people who want to quit smoking are really worried about their health. Well, you can get a lot of free services at these quit lines, including nicotine-containing gum, drugs, if you qualify, that will help you reduce the craving for nicotine. Why don't we offer radon testing there? No quit line offers radon testing, except maybe one. So what we did is we're going to say, well, could we offer radon testing in the quit line? Callers are calling up anyway, and it's a very simple little dialogue they're told. And they say, thank you very much for calling, and we appreciate your interest in reducing your risk from lung cancer. What if we told you there's something you could do to your home that would reduce your risk for lung cancer? Would you use a radon test if we sent it to you? Yeah, that's a good question. Well, in the first 2 years of the quit line, we had 500 callers, and half of them said, yes, send me a test. And what's better is that half of them sent in a test, but unlike the parents and unlike the college students, there was a much higher rate at which they actually returned the test. And why is that? Because they're worried, okay? They're motivated. They're at a point in their lives where they've realized, you know, maybe I ought to do something. And that's when you want to hit people, when they've reached a sort of a critical moment in making decisions. By the way, you know, we got demographic information, of course, on these people, and sent them test kits and also measured the radon because we got the radon tests back. We got the results back ourselves. But what's, of course, sobering is that about 95% of these people started smoking when they were children. And every cigarette manufacturer knows this. That's why cigarettes are marketed very, very heavily to teens, because very few people start smoking after their 30s or even their 20s. The youngest caller we had started smoking at 5. There's the variation that you might expect in terms of how many packs a day individuals smoked. Most of them 1 or 2 pack a day smokers. Some of them were 4 pack a day smokers. So think about this for a minute. They are probably spending more money buying cigarettes than they are spending buying food, because 4 packs of cigarettes starts to add up in price. We asked what they knew about radon, and the most interesting thing about this is that a lot of them sort of vaguely knew that they were supposed to test for radon, but they didn't know why. Only 1 in 5 of these callers knew that radon caused lung cancer. They're concerned about quitting smoking because they're concerned about lung cancer, but 80% of them had no idea that radon caused lung cancer. And only about 7% of them said that they learned about radon from their healthcare provider. And we know that's true because we had previously surveyed family physicians in North Dakota with Dr. Schwartz, who's the chair of family and community medicine. And we sent surveys and we followed them up, and only about 10% of physicians, even though they told people to stop smoking, and even though they knew about radon, only 10% of them ever talked about radon to their patients. So this is the other side of that, and that is actually, I'm sure that's an accurate number. Interestingly, we of course got the reports of radon from the lab. They were anonymized, but this is 4 right here. Here's where the lung cancer risk increases 10 times. And the highest radon level that we found was 36, or 72 cigarettes, in addition to the cigarettes that they were smoking. So what did we learn about the quit line? What's the take-home message from the quit line? Well, half of the people who called asked for a free test. 30%, which is probably the highest rate actually in the literature, returned to the lab, but radon knowledge was really, really low. Only 1 in 5 of these people knew, before they called at least, that radon caused lung cancer. I think the take-home message in terms of sort of public health is that quit lines are an incredibly cost-effective way to target the group at highest risk for lung cancer and give them something that they might be able to use to take appropriate steps. Remember, some of these people are getting medicines worth hundreds of dollars in order to quit smoking. And by the way, once we demonstrated this in the quit line in North Dakota, the quit line has now taken over the expense. We're not doing anything. They're buying all the test kits, and this has changed the quit line. So the quit line in North Dakota is now the first in the world, actually, to offer free radon testing. And many other states, Nevada, Kentucky, are now copying it. So UND really is the first in this, and it's a point of pride for us. Here's the largest sort of take-home message that I want to tell you. If you're looking for something to work on that makes a difference in the lives of North Dakotans, radon is it. And it's also quite flexible in terms of actually getting funded for it. Radon is a health disparity. It's a health disparity because more affluent, better educated people know more about radon, they can afford to test, and they can afford to remediate. So any granting agency that is concerned about health disparities, and there are many, would be interested in radon. Radon causes cancer, lung cancer, it probably causes leukemia, and it causes stroke. So there are abundant places, CDC, Environmental Protection Agency, National Cancer Institute, Neurological Diseases and Stroke, as well as philanthropic groups like the American Lung Association, who are very interested in funding work on radon. Radon is kind of like family entertainment in the sense there's something for everyone. There's work to do, a lot of work to do in communication. In biology, we're working on a method now in which you can actually just take radium-containing rocks and actually expose cells to radon naturally and look at cell gene expression, which is a very interesting model. Certainly medical education, engineering. We have to make ways to make radon testing cheaper. Health policy. Are there any laws about testing for radon in North Dakota? None. It's the irony of having the state with the largest amount of this radioactive gas and zero legislation. There's a lot of opportunity for health policy. and prevention research. Again, radon is an incredibly important carcinogen, causes stroke. We have more of it in North Dakota than anyone. It's a huge opportunity for UND to lead the nation in radon research. And speaking of leaders in radon research, I want to point out that those people are right here because I get a chance to talk about radon, but a lot of the work, Dr. Kim, Dr. Klug, Dr. Wantra, Dave Schmitz, Mark Williamson, my colleague Eric Witzel in Chapel Hill have done the work on radon. And by the way, if you are interested in radon and are concerned about it, maybe what you worry, and haven't, you can go to the Grand Forks Public Library and borrow, just like you could borrow a book, you could borrow a radon detector that's digital. It looks just like this, because it is just like this. And it will give you the radon level in your house or apartment within hours. And so UND has now provided digital radon detector libraries in Grand Forks. There are 3 of them now in Fargo, at every library in Fargo. And at the end of this month, we'll have a radon detector lending library in Bismarck. It's very good public policy. It's very good public relations for the university. And take it from me, it's a good thing to do. That's all I got. But I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. And if they're very difficult questions, I'm going to turf them to Mark and Sujat in the audience. And if you do test your house and you got a great number, yes?
Just wondering if the lung cancer rates in North Dakota or Grand Forks are elevated. Is that noticeable?
Well, those are 2 very good questions. Are they elevated? Yes. Are they noticeable? Sort of. The reason that they're not, I believe, as noticeable as you might think, is that only about 10% of lung cancer is caused by radon. So if you're adding 10% to something, it has to be a very, very small number before you see that elevation. But the incidence rates for all respiratory cancers, lung cancer, laryngeal cancer, buccal cancer, are elevated in North Dakota, as are the rates for most leukemias. 2 excellent questions. Yes, ma'am?
Is there a simple test that can be done with your GP? Is it a blood test? What can we do when we go and see our doctor once or twice a year?
You can measure your house.
That I've done.
Okay. If you're worried about your risk for lung cancer screening, if you're a heavy smoker or have a history of smoking, you can essentially get a CT scan to look for premalignant lesions. I think sputum cytology, which has been attempted as a lung cancer pre-screening tool, is not that successful. It's one of those things that you can prevent, but is not so good at treating. Although lung cancer has made some amazing treatments, so among the few people who have genetic forms of lung cancer for which targeted therapies exist, some forms of lung cancer which were previously fatal are now completely treatable. But the majority of lung cancer that is caused by, say, smoking still has a grim prognosis.
Look for first is a lung cancer, not a blood cancer. I'm just curious, because my husband has been through cancer, so I just don't know if he's now susceptible or what have you. And we just put in our mitigator a couple months ago because we finally figured it out.
Yeah, it's a good point. Many people first learn about radon when they or a family member is diagnosed with lung cancer, and they say, well, this must be a mistake because I've never smoked. And often they're told, well, have you ever tested your home for radon? And people say, tested my home for what? There is no real screening tests for leukemia, just to get back to your question, because the evidence is that leukemia, particularly chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which is the commonest leukemia among adults, surprisingly, there is no benefit for early treatment, so that if you're treated later, you do just as well as you were treated earlier. Usually the recommendation there is to wait if it becomes symptomatic. About half of people who present with CLL don't need treatment right away. The other half do. And there is a genetic test for that. So the form of leukemias that are more aggressive are actually fairly well known. What you might do if you're concerned about it is when you go in for primary care, ask for a CBC, because that's not often done. I didn't get a CBC done until I asked for one. So that was probably the only thing you can do about that point. So if any of you test and get a really wild number, come in and tell me about it, because I'm kind of collecting them. Anonymously, of course. Thanks very much.